Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads wrap up. I've got lots of books because it's been an extended period interrupted by, first of all, me finishing a novel, but second of all, I got COVID last week, so I'm all recovered now, but I've got quite an extensive backlog to talk about. A couple of poetry books, Chang, Obit, and Canisla Lubrin, the Dyzgraphxst. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Then a book of short stories, but done in an intriguing way, Centuria, Oroboric novels by the Italian Giorgio Manganelli. This was translated by Henry Martin. I was sent by the publishers, Sagging Meniscus, a couple of books. This is the first one called Like It Matters by Klein. Obviously this is a galley proof, not the actual what it will look like in the end. When I come to talk about this book, I will post a picture of the cover. Croft, The Extinction of Irena Ray. Freidrich Durrenmatt, The Assignment. This was translated by Joel Agee. Durrenmatt was Swiss. This was written in German. A couple of short plays by Fredrico, Garcia, Lorca, The Public and Play Without a Title, and these were translated by Carlos Bauer. And then a couple of non-fiction books, The Book Against Death by Elias Canetti, translated from the German. Actually, these may not have been translated. Yes, translated from the German by Peter Filkins, and The Secret Life by Andrew O'Hagan, 3 true stories. So I'm going to start with the poetry books. Chang, Obit, and this is a collection about processing grief, which I just thought was brilliant. Grief over a father who had a stroke and increasingly lost his mental functions and speech to some form of dementia, and a mother who had serious pulmonary lung disease that eventually carried her off into death. And most of it is done in the form of something died. So she's not talking directly about the passing of her parents. She's trying to sort of preserve them in words, preserve the pictures in her head as memory, but is frustrated by not being able to do so. So it's not just her parents who've died, but there are all these sort of adjectives and descriptives that have died, which mean that she can't preserve them, only she can, because she does it brilliantly in these poems. So, for example, civility died on June the 24th, 2009, or optimism died on August the 3rd, 2015. So I'm just going to read 3 short extracts. This first one is about her mother. When her lungs began their failing, she could still say you, but not thank. You don't know what it's like, she said, when I told her to stop yelling at my father. She was right. When language leaves, all you have left is tone. All you have left are smoke signals. I didn't know she was using her own body as wood. That's just chilling. On to the next extract. Doctors died on July the 16th, 2014. Dr. Lynch was supposed to be the best. I researched, I called, I asked, I read. All my schooling had prepared me to help my mother. I was the youngest and most educated child of death. 100 people in the waiting room, all pulling green oxygen cylinders. I had all the air to myself, but I couldn't breathe. Again, just absolutely chilling and so evocative. And finally, her father, who's had a fall and has got more brain bleed. His brain now had an accent and no one could understand how to stop him from learning the new language. My mother called and she said he fell on the treadmill, hit his head. Blood thinners spread his blood like moonlight. They drilled holes in his head, vacuumed out the blood and more words. My father was finally arrested. He turned in the rest of his words, they bound his tongue, and he dreamed in blank paper. So I just thought this collection was fabulous. I'm not really one who reads a lot of sort of attempts to deal and process grief. But I thought this was so targeted in terms of what the absence of a person who's died means. Not just the fact they're not going to call on the phone and all of that. This is just so poetically and metaphorically beautiful. It reminded me of Annie Ernaux's book about her mother's Alzheimer's, whose name I can't remember. If I can find the link to my review of that, I'll post that. 5 stars. And on to Canisla Lubrin, the Dyzgraphxst. Now, I really wanted to like this book, this collection, because I admired its verve, its brio, its sort of frictionless movement across cultures and languages and oceans, but I just couldn't quite tune into its wavelength. And for me, it proved quite sort of instructive that sort of towards the end, on page 150, when she's visiting her father in an old age people's home who's suffering from dementia, I went to see my father, blinded in his inborn pericranial debris, red-black, purple-black, new-black, ultra-black, black light. Definitely not partially blind, he says, he with his gone sight skying the ceiling with the uneasy movement of his eyes. I had to look up, had to fall into this museum of once useful things, boxes of matches, stark prevalence of spent days I can't remember now, except how bright, yellow, blue, green, red, the brown and rust, and the still mortared wood beams, man, I call his name, Dada, sac cafete. I watched him know, my voice, cut through the way-high volume of his stereo, as though to enter myself, how I enter the hothouse of his bedroom, his whole life nearly cordoned now. I watch my father search for my name, I watch my father knowing my voice, I watch my father remembering my face. I watch the confirming movements of his hands, considering me there, wholly uncharacteristic, consider me as a certain elasticity you can enter, the ordinariness of the waves, the scar debating an end to its pathology, the basic fabric living recaptured ideals, sacred, justement, as a man, needing to remember his seed by voice, to make and leave fortunes, unexchangeable outside of myself, I'm always leaving. And I think it's interesting to me that is a place of stillness, where she's come to ground. She's sort of rooted in visiting her father, who himself is pretty sort of bodily sort of restrained by blindness and by sort of grey dementia, whereas the rest of it has this sort of, as I say, oceanic, planetary sort of sweep, and I just found it hard to hold on to her coattails. So I gave this 3.5 stars, which on Goodreads I rounded down to 3, but I think the fault is mine and not hers. And on to Centuria, Euroboric novels by Giorgio and Manganelli. Now, the sort of format for this is that Manganelli found some outsized paper, printing paper, or writing paper that sort of wasn't A4 or whatever the normal, was. And so he decided to write 100 stories, but each story had to fit precisely on one page of this paper. So it was sort of slightly mandated writing, not in terms of the language he could use, but in terms of the number of words he had to play with. It had to fit on one sheet of paper, 100 times. And like any short story collection, there's some intriguing ones and there's some meh ones. So the ones I preferred were, so there's a story about an atheist who's commissioned by 2 priests to design them a new church, which causes an existential crisis for him, because as a professional architect, how could he inhabit the fibre and the spirit of a religious building, because he himself is an atheist? And I thought that was a really good story. And another one where a bell maker is commissioned to make a unique bell, which is the bell that will sound Judgment Day, which I just thought was a fascinating story. However, there are too many stories about sort of lovers who are not natural lovers, not naturally attracted to each other. They're both outsiders, but it's that outsiderness that draws them together seemingly into what would be a perfect relationship. And some that are perfect relationships, and others are, no, they maintain their sort of seclusion even from a seemingly perfect partner. And that sort of extends out to stories such as someone is looking for something that's missing in their life, and they do this for so long and in such a tense way that actually their life becomes filled with the search, and the search becomes valuable in and of itself, irrespective of whether there's something at the end of this search. So there's no longer something missing in their life because they now have purpose. So on the whole, I found those stories a bit tricksy, a bit glib, sort of playing with words, but not in a not in a profound way. So I was a bit of a mixed bag. There's 3 stars. Now on to Like It Matters. As I say, this was provided by the publishers. It's published this week. This is the actual cover, and it's the story of Throop Robling, who's a struggling independent writer, author of fiction. He's had 1 book published, but he and his equally struggling independent writer mates, 6 in all, are meeting in a pub on the anniversary of Bloomsday, 107 years since the original publication of Joyce's novel, and they do this every year. That's a good excuse to get drunk and also to have a moan up about their struggles as independent authors. And they're waiting for to be joined by an author who's actually sort of made it, and who they all have grudging admiration for. He's hugely popular and has sort of rather eschewed the independent great work of art, great American novel route, and has sort of made sort of more compromises for sort of plot and character, but still manages to straddle the line between that and literary fiction. So most of this book is writers talking about writing and the writing process and the publishing industry and things like that. Now, I am a writer. I recognise an awful lot of what's been discussed in this book, but I cannot take myself out of being a writer to know what it's like for a reader to read these things. I don't know how interesting or how indulgent it is for writers to write forensically and microscopically about their lives as writers. So I can't, as I say, I can't take myself out as a writer enough to see that in isolation. So, to give you a couple of examples that spoke very, very true to me. My wife described it as playing dolls, how she and her sister played dolls and moved them around and made them talk and get in little fights. You do it too, she said, except you're grown men playing with language for a so-called reader. However, you dress your dolls up, she said. All the talk about point of view, plot and character dynamics, setting, dialogue, the art of exaggeration. It's only to make it seem like you aren't playing dolls, animating inanimate humanoids with projections of language. All the shop talk, she said, legitimises what's essentially playing dolls in your imagination and leaving behind a trail of language. Playing dolls in language, she said, and I laughed, happy to have married a woman who makes fun of what we do. Now that's sort of 2/3 of the way into the book, because the representation of the woman's point of view is actually quite unrepresentative of this book, because however much I can or can't remove my writer's glasses when I read this, what I did feel very strongly is this is about male writers, and were 6 women to be gathered around a table in a bar discussing their lives and their writing lives, it wouldn't read the. I don't believe it would read the same to me. And I think that is one flaw of the book, that it's too much about sort of male obsessions within writing, and publishing has there's still a long way to go, but it has moved on from sort of male concerns about writing. It does admit other viewpoints and other takes on writing. And it's implicit, it's stated here, because where the book is interesting, I feel, is that Throop is about to have his first child with his wife. And that throws the whole sort of writing career into doubt. How much is he going to be able to do initially in the first few years when it's all hands on deck with a young dependent? He talks in terms of a book being rejected being like in the past, being rejected by a woman when you asked to go out on a date with her. He doesn't see it like that anymore. You know, that's the sort of the juvenile or the teenage writer. Now, you know, now he's sort of matured more into it. He also says that, you know, with overpopulation in the world, you know, do we need a new life to be brought into it? In the same way as, do we need more books brought into the world? Who needs those books? And I think that's where the book is interesting. It is a counterpoint to it being so relentlessly and remorselessly male, but they don't sit easily. You know, the women don't enter, you know, the book at all until, as I say, about two-thirds of the way through, when they're joined by young women writers who are, you know, it annoys Throop that their male gathering has been, you know, invaded, as he sees it, or contaminated by women writers. So I think there are problems with the gendering within this book, even though it avowedly is also looking at that, and, you know, looking at sort of boys finally growing up to become fathers and men. Again, just writing about childhood by teens or writers in their 20s mostly comes off as juvenile. Writing about childhood is best by someone much older, who lived it, forgot it, and lives through it again with their own children in a way that jars long-lost memories. Temporal distance reclaims or recovers or reveals the space of childhood. And, you know, that absolutely was my experience with my two books, Dream Diaries in the Key of G and Stories We Tell Our Children, which are absolutely inspired by becoming a father to twin boys and to reclaiming my own memories of sort of childhood and growing up, which I had pretty much sort of lost or was unable to recover until I started being able to observe it with an adult eye through the guise of my children. I will say also, I think there are one or two places where this book's a bit repetitive. That it's, because, as I say, it's such forensic detail about the writing process and what's involved in publishing and stuff. And I think he goes over the same ground a couple of times. And, you know, there are, you know, whole chapters devoted to the mates around the table, forensically dissecting them as people, and in doing so, their faults as writers. I thought that was well done. But again, I can't, as a writer, I can't remove myself from the effectiveness and the interest of that for a reader. So, you know, it is very well written. As I say, it's highly recognisable to me as an author. But I find it hard to put a sort of, you know, a completely objective viewpoint on it. And that's it, really. I would give it 3.5 stars rounded up to 4. That's Lee Klein's Like It Matters. Oh, and interestingly, the epigram at the start of the book is from this purported author that they're all waiting to turn up. So he's an imaginary author, but the epigram comes from him, which is something like, "Write like your life depends on it," hence the title, Like It Matters. I thought that was quite neat. And in a way, there is a bit of Waiting for Godot about this guy. I mean, he does turn up, but the 6 of them around this table getting gradually more and more drunk and more resentful did have the feel of Vladimir and Estragon a bit. And on to Jennifer Croft's The Extinction of Irena A. So Jennifer Croft is a translator, and one of the books she translated was Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. And I think that very much inspires or lies behind this book, because this is a book about a group of 8 translators who've all been invited to the house of their Polish author, who may or may not be up for a Nobel Prize. But the way she works is she demands total dedication from her translators. They're not allowed to translate any other book. They all meet together to translate into their individual languages at the same time. It's almost like a symposium in her house, which is in the on the edge of an ancient forest in Poland. So there's lots of resonances with Tokarczuk in this. And indeed, Tokarczuk gives a blurb where it says, "Croft writes with remarkable intensity," which I think is a bit abrupt, really. So I wonder sort of what Tokarczuk's attitude towards his book is, because in places it does seem very much sort of, you know, to stem from her. But anyway, so these 8 translators all turn up to this Polish writer's house to take receipt of the new manuscript, the new novel manuscript, which they are to translate then and there in this sort of group, sort of collectivity. They notice, the first thing they notice is that the author's partner is not present, and he isn't always normally there. And within a day, the author herself disappears, and leaving these 8 authors, you know, sort of where's she gone? What's happened to her? But also with the task of, well, do we carry on translating? And that's sort of the core of what they should be doing. But they also sort of get involved in other things, like the ancient forest is under threat of logging, being sold off to logging industries by the sort of right-wing Polish government. So they get involved in a campaign or ways to try and stop that. As foreigners, they stand out very much in amongst the local village. There's all sorts of weird and strange goings on between the locals and them. So there's all these sort of different. There's also the interrelationships between these translators. There's the original Czech translator had died reportedly, so the 8 was topped up, as it were, by the Polish author recruiting a Norwegian and Swedish translator, who suddenly becomes the subject of sexual competition between the Spanish translator, who's actually Argentinian, and the American translator, who's obviously responsible for the English translation. And this guy is in a sort of, you know, in the middle, as I say, of a tug of war between these 2 women. And the form of the book itself is, it's not the book that's being translated. We're not getting that. We're getting the story of what happened over the 8-week period, or however long it was, where they're inhabiting the author's house with all these other things going in different directions, translating the book, saving the forest, what's happened to the author, sexual jealousies, all this sort of stuff, as if written by the Spanish translator. But it's not. She's the narrator, but it's actually written by the American. So she's sort of casting, you know, her acerbic view on the work, on the story as told by the narrator, and how unreliable and one-sided it is, and jaundiced and all that sort of thing. And I did think that actually the English translator, the American woman, who supposedly has written this book, has really reined herself in from attacking her rival. There are footnotes, there are things saying, no, she's got that wrong, or I didn't care, you know, she thought I did, but I didn't care. But actually it's extremely reined in and considered. I thought a lot more could be made of that, and indeed that's my own sort of novel that I've just finished, is very much that, with a memoirist having a parallel text to the memoir that she's reproducing, that she's transliterating from tapes, from recorded tapes. And her commentary is extremely acerbic, a takedown of her subject. This didn't go so far. And all in all, you know, I enjoyed the start of it. I thought it was a great beginning. There was lots of interesting points about translation, you know, the relationship of translators to the original text and things like that. You know, they only referred to each other. They could only speak Polish, even though the Polish author's no longer present. It's the only language they share, the only lingua franca within that house. And initially they only called each other by the language. You know, that she's Spanish, she's English, he's Swedish. But that very quickly slips away, and it gets more personal, and they call each other by their actual names, and they get more involved in the relationships. Interestingly, they're trying to save this ancient forest, but all the while, you know, they're destroying this carefully crafted and architected haven that the author has built herself on the edge of the forest, because there's 8 people inhabiting a house, and there's, you know, they very quickly run out of food, and, you know, what to do. You know, they sort of casually break things they don't need to in searching for her, searching for clues. All these, there's a great sort of thread of destruction which is never highlighted, never emphasised, but it's there running throughout. The basic trashing of this house, which I thought was rather nice. However, towards the end, it does get sort of more and more ridiculous as they sort of hit on a clue to track down this author, and they end up in the old Tempelhof airport at Berlin. And yeah, it rather lost me by then. It got a sort of bit plot-based rather than continuing some of its more interesting sort of thematic streams. So it was a mixed bag, and I gave it... what I would describe it as is it would be sort of like Lord of the Flies, and instead of sort of, young children reverting to primitivism, it's what if you took a bunch of effete translators and literary types and unleashed them into a wilderness, in this case the wilderness being on the edge of this forest, but also in this carefully crafted house. So it's a very effete form of Lord of the Flies. I mean, that was the sort of way I sort of sold it to myself when I sort of again teetered on what rating to give it. So I gave it 3.5, rounded down to 3. And on to Freidrich Durrenmatt, the assignment. This was provided for me, sent to me by Bob Black, one of my most dedicated subscribers. I think he just read it and had rather loved it. And I can see why. It's a very well crafted book, but it was a bit sort of, by the end, it was a bit ho-hum for me. A psychologist or a psychotherapist is married to his wife. He is observing her sort of psychoanalytically. She has periods of depression and things. What he doesn't realise is that she's observing him for signs of, not being a robot. Is there any passion? Can he display passion and genuine affection, or is everything always with this sort of professional, detached eye? And in the end, when the book starts, she's taken herself off to a foreign country, which is either in the Middle East or North Africa, and under mysterious circumstances has died. And the husband is bereft. He thinks he's very guilty. He thinks he's driven her to his death by his sort of seeming lack of care and neglect of her emotional needs. So he commissions a documentary filmmaker to go and get on the case and see how she died, what those mysterious circumstances are. So then he sort of disappears from the story, and we shift through the viewpoint of this documentary filmmaker. So she enters this country, which is raw, it's sort of teetering on the point of revolution. There's a sort of a power struggle between the head of security and the head of secret services, intelligence, and they sort of increasingly clamp down on what she can and can't film. And it gets slightly sort of more and more baroque and involved and sort of spy stuff. And it's all very, pleasantly well done. I just didn't think there was much behind it. I didn't think it had much... I'm not saying it was sort of an exercise in style and storytelling, but I didn't quite see what the point of it all was, other than telling a good yarn, a good ripping yarn, which it was. So for that reason, I gave it 4. But I was slightly mystified as to quite what it was intending to sort of wreak upon its reader. And on to Lorca's couple of plays. I don't think that either were ever in his lifetime were performed. If you know Lorca, obviously there's his poetry, but there's also his playwriting, sort of famous plays like Gypsy Wedding and The House of Bernarda Alba, which are very sort of rural Spain, traditional households, women, young girls, very much under the thumb of the father, all that sort of stuff, very claustrophobic. These were written at a similar time, and these are much more radical. There seem to be 2 parts of Lorca, the one that he sort of felt he could present to Spain, but the one that he really sort of felt, but also felt that was far more problematical. Both plays are sort of set in theatres where there's sort of revolution, either not only outside, but also revolution on stage. They channel sort of Brecht in terms of addressing the audience and breaking down the fourth wall. The audience are addressed where the orchestra pit is in a theatre, but it's actually, some of them are actors in there. sort of bantering to and fro with the characters on stage. It also channels Jean Genet's plays. I say channels, and it precedes them, like The Blacks and The Balcony, in terms of sort of characters changing their costume and also their gender as they, you know, they throw off one set of clothes to emerge in another, which suggests they're of a different gender. You know, I found these sort of really eye-opening, because I was only used to the Lorca of the traditional stuff. You know, this is wonderfully radical stuff. And it just had one brilliant line. The first bomb of the revolution blew the Professor of Rhetoric's head off. I just thought that was very pithy and to the point. So I thought these are really interesting. They have since been performed. 4 stars. And on to 2 works of non-fiction. So I haven't finished Elias Canetti's The Book of Death, but I nearly have. I have nearly. But this Chang, my interest in this is, you know, I'm interested in all things death. I have an unpublished novel called Solipsistic Conversations with Close Friends. And interestingly, this book affirms a lot of what I was doing in that book. But pleasingly to me, I think my book's a lot wider. So what this is that over the course of his life, every year he kept a separate journal for musings on death, which obsessed him all his life, as it has me. And that there are some 2,000 pages of this stuff, which Fitzgeraldo have sort of edited down to about 318 pages, and they're arranged by year, so his musings year on year on year. And a lot of the aphorisms or slightly longer meditations I felt were a bit sort of literary and didn't really say anything profound. When he sort of threw in stories from other cultures, such as ancient Chinese myths or Hindu myths or Arabic myths, those I found much more engaging. And the bit I haven't read is as we get into the 80s and 90s, and I understand he talks about things like the death of Saddam Hussein and things like that. So they may be more engaging. But having said that, some of the aphorisms really packed a punch. So I'm just going to read you 3 of them. Being aphorisms, they're very short. Just bear with me while I find them. Tell stories until no one else dies. 1,001 nights, 1,000,001 nights. So I'm just looking over there because I've got the page numbers noted down. I have constructed a library that will last for a good 300 years. All I need now are those years. The worms congratulate him upon his 160th birthday. Because by the time you've been in your grave, 60 years, however long it is, there's only the worms around to send you to mark your anniversary. The most ingenious, the most careful, the most painful, the most patient, the most precise fictional depictions have never once scratched the surface of death. Right on, preach, brother. That's exactly the premise from which my own novel starts from. So initially, I wasn't sure about this book, but actually there's enough in it that I would give it 4 stars. So it's called The Book Against Death, and that word against has sort of 2 sort of shades of meaning. The first is in the sense of like being an amulet or a talisman of protection against death, or that this book that Canetti has written is like a Bible of death, that collecting all his thoughts, all possible sort of takes on the subject of death that might somehow insulate him and protect him. I mean, of course, that's a futile gesture. But as he himself says, that every time he writes something in this journal about death, it means he's still alive. You know, cogito ergo sum, or in this case, I write, therefore I am. And the other sense of against is that it's in opposition to. I mean, again, that sort of futile notion of, you know, being in opposition to death. But he means it in a sort of a wider sense, in that a lot of the aphorisms are about the death of an individual, be it his forthcoming death or the death of those in his circle, family, friends, that sort of thing. But he also has a great concern with death within humanity, particularly war. I mean, this book absolutely rages against war and sort of tyranny, and he says that dictators kill so many people under their regime because that's how they perceive the only method in which it preserves them, that they will, you know, continue to live. I mean, obviously, again, they will die at the end, but it has those sort of Countess of Bathroy vibes, where she bathed every day in virgin blood in order to preserve her beauty. And what Canetti sort of says is that dictators need to keep killing people in order to, you know, sort of keep their own mortality at arm's length. And finally, The Secret Life by Andrew Hagen, 3 true stories. So this is the stories of how Andrew Hagen was commissioned to write Julian Assange's biography. The biography of the guy who hid behind a pseudonym, who supposedly sort of made cryptocurrency burst upon the scene and be a real thing. And then the third one, where O'Hagan indulges in an experiment where he takes the name of someone who died as a very young child from a great, you know, he takes it from their headstone in a cemetery. And in this modern age of technology, creates a whole persona and being for this guy as if he really had lived, and ends up meeting the guy's true mother and things like that. And I have to say, although there wasn't very much surprising in that story, it was the most touching, because the other 2 stories, the Assange and the crypto guy, neither of them really want to give their stories, but they're forced to by contractual obligations because they need the money. Assange to defend himself in court against the extradition order, and the other guy, I can't remember exactly, it was some part of his self-revelation, which was going to be biographied by O'Hagan, was somehow tied in with some court case. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically his 2 main sitters in this book are very unwilling participants and are always evading giving him the skinny. And O'Hagan is interestingly is skillful enough himself not to fall into their myth. So in a way, both stories are standoffs. O'Hagan won't allow himself to be sucked in and manipulated, but equally he's unable to push these 2 guys into being truthful and giving him their biography. So it's not the 2 stories are not the stories of the biographies of these guys. It's about this crazy process of guys who are contractually obliged to talk to O'Hagan and spill their stories, doing everything they can not to do that, which I found of limited interest, I have to say. I'm not interested in Julian Assange as a personality. I'm not interested in cryptocurrency. It doesn't surprise me that these guys seem to be running from their own selves and not actually all that clued in as to themselves. They are, to some extent, sociopaths. They're not very good at sort of dealing in polite society or even impolite society. So there wasn't that much of interest in this. 3 stars. So there you have it. Apologies for it being such a long wrap up, but as I said, there were lots of books from at least the last month that for one reason or another got sort of diffused and spread out over the period. So till next time, thanks very much.